What's up guys, Asian here again, another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Dragonknight tank. This is going to be a video that kind of explores a utility role, more of a utilitarian role for a tank. So this is going to be more in line with a tank that is remaining with the group. It's not necessarily going to be a tank that needs to find ways to self-sustain. So this is kind of a very generic tank role. So the thing with support roles in ESO is that you have to be very adaptable to the fight at hand. So depending on what boss you're facing, what content you're running, this build might not be the best build for that content, and so you're going to need to figure out on your own whether or not this build is suitable for the content that you're running. So this particular build is designed to be a fairly good fit for most scenarios. There are going to be situations where this build won't necessarily be as good, but the general idea is that you'll be able to use this build in basically 99% of the content that you're going to end up running here. So, just like our other build videos, we'll be going over our gear, we'll be going over skill bars, CP point distributions, race, attributes, food, things like that. Tanks don't really have a rotation to speak of, but we'll kind of go over kind of the priorities of tanking and kind of what you should be doing as you're tanking, so you guys have an idea of what's going on in my mindset while we are tanking bet content. And because we don't have a rotation, obviously we can't do a parse or anything like that. I currently don't have any recently recorded videos of any sort of trial runs using this build. I just haven't had the time, and I've been having internet issues, so I haven't been able to stream or record things as much as I would like. So I don't have any content like that in order to show you guys, but I will try to discuss it a little bit here and there. So starting things off first with gear, so this particular setup, I'm going to give you basically like 2 or 3 options for each gear set. So I do have several different setups on my tank, again because you do need to adapt to the situation at hand depending on the content that you're running. So this is kind of the go-to that I go to, setup that I go to for most of the content that we usually end up running. So for our monster helm, we're going with Bloodspawn. Bloodspawn comes from, I believe it is, not Banner Cell, Spindle Clutch 2. So you need to do that on vet in order to get the helm. If you do need to do that, but Bloodspawn is available to basically everybody in the game. So that's why we're using Bloodspawn. So there are other monster helm sets that you can use, and we'll go over those when I finish talking about the sets that we're using on this particular build here. So Bloodspawn's there primarily for that ultimate generation. Even though it's only a 6% chance to proc, because you're taking a lot of damage as a tank, you will find that it procs fairly often, and it really helps out your ultimate regen. Even if it procs every 14 seconds, that's still an additional ultimate per second, and normally you will have it proc not on cooldown but fairly often. I normally have around 50 to 60% uptime on Bloodspawn in most fights, so it is a pretty good set for ultimate generation for extra Warhorn uptime. For our first 5-piece set, so the way I kind of think of tanking sets is that you have one selfish or one health set. You can kind of use those interchangeably, and then you have a debuff / group utility set. So our health set for this setup is going to be Ebon. Ebon comes from Crypt of Hearts 1 or 2, and so you can get it in armor or jewelry. I like to have it in all armor, so that way you have all legendary armor pieces. So you can, because Ebon jewelry currently, while there are gold jewelry out there, and it has been on the Golden Trader, the Weekend Trader in Cyrodiil, those jewelry pieces are not tradable. So if you missed out on them, you're going to have to wait until they come up next in the rotation, and we don't really know when that's going to be. So that's why I have Ebon on my armor pieces, so I can get that gold quality, that legendary quality for that 5-piece bonus. So while we're on the topic of armor, let's talk about traits real quick. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with traits for tanking. This is what I like to use, but I will talk about another option that a lot of other tanks are starting to turn to due to the changes in block costs that came around with Dragon Bones. So I like to have infused on my large pieces. So I have an infused chests and legs, and I use prismatic enchants, so tri-stat enchants on those. You'll notice that I have divines on my helm and my shoulders. I like to have divines in order to help out my magicka regen, because we are using the Atronach to help out our magicka regen, but if I did have an infused helm, I would use it here, and again with the prismatic enchant to help out my resource pools. Now I do have sturdy on my small pieces here to decrease the cost of block, and again, if I wasn't using divines, I would, if I don't have a sturdy shoulder and I don't want to spend the crystals to transmute it, so I have divines here, but if I had the option, I would use a sturdy piece here. Now for the small pieces, I have 3 health enchants and 1 stamina enchant. You don't have to use a stamina enchant for this particular build because we are using Alkosh, so we have additional stamina from the jewelry pieces. However, if you're going to go with something like Torug's instead, you always want to have your stamina pool be higher than your magical pool because of the way shards and orbs work. They return resources to your highest resource pool out of magicka and stamina. So you always want stamina to be higher. So that's why I have a stamina enchant here. And that's just to make sure that my stamina is going to be always higher than my magicka. So that's kind of why we have the stamina enchant there. But if you are a race like, let's say, Red Guards, where you have extra stamina, then you might not necessarily need this particular stamina enchant here. You could go with the health enchant instead. I am a Dark Elf, so I have 9% additional magicka versus the 6% additional stamina. So my magicka pools are naturally going to be a little bit higher compared to, let's say, an Imperial tank or a Red Guard tank. So I do need to be a little bit mindful of how much stamina I have, so I do need to use that stamina enchant there. For our group utility set, we're going with Alkosh. Alkosh comes from Maw of Blockade. You don't need to use gold jewelry like I have here. You can just use the blue jewelry from normal Maw, or you can get lucky and get the purple jewelry from the weekly coffers that you get from completing normal Maw. So we have I need to actually change this enchant here, but we will have 2 shield plate enchants, and this enchant's actually going to be a reduced feat cost enchant, so that reduces the stamina cost of all your abilities. So now they did nerf, or rather they didn't nerf, but they changed the way that shield plate enchants work. Now shield plate enchants are taken away from the block cost, the initial block cost, rather than taken away at the very end after all of the percentage decreases are taken into account. So shield plate enchants aren't as strong as they used to be, so your block cost is going to be fairly high. So you can go with 3 shield plate enchants if you'd like. However, you also have to take into consideration the reduced feat cost does reduce the cost of things like Pierce Armor and Heroic Slashes, which you will be using fairly often. I mean, I try to use them at least every 8 to 10 seconds, so having that reduced feat cost does help conserve stamina in its own way. It doesn't reduce the cost of blocking, but it does reduce the cost of other stamina abilities, so that's useful for sustain. But again, you can go with 3 shield plate enchants if you'd like. So for our front bar, we have a sword and shield, obviously. So I have an infused sword with a crusher enchant. You can go with any one-handed weapon as long as it's infused and you have a crusher enchant. And then for my shield, I have reinforced with a prismatic enchant. The shield trait, you don't have to use reinforced. You can go with nirnhoned, you can go with infused, you can go with sturdy. So you have a lot of options in terms of traits for your shield here. I'm still sticking with reinforced mainly because I don't have a sturdy shield yet. But you can go with sturdy or infused, or you can even transmute them into the trait that you would like. I just don't want to use my crystals to transmute armor when I can use them to transmute weapons instead. Now for our back bar, I have an infused Asylum's lightning staff, but you can use basically any lightning staff really. This is just something that I've managed to pick up because I have it left over. I have it infused with a weakening enchant on it. You can use a different enchant here if you'd like. Something like Absorb Stamina wouldn't be a bad choice, or even something like Crusher. While you will be doubling up on the Crusher enchants, it's not a bad idea in order to help maintain 100% Crusher uptime. So the lightning staff here, obviously we're not going to be blocking on it because we don't have the same level of block cost reduction and block damage reduction on our lightning staff back bar. And if you do want to continue to use a staff on your back bar, then you might want to consider using an ice staff. Don't get the, I believe it's the Trifocus passive, get the Ancient Knowledge passive, so that will boost the amount of reduce the cost of blocking as well as increase the amount of damage you can block with an ice staff. Just make sure you don't get the Trifocus passive, because then you start using magicka to block, and you kind of want to avoid doing that. But we have the staff back here mainly because of Blockade in order to help our Crusher enchant uptimes, and I'll talk about that when we go over the skill bars. So you don't necessarily need to use a staff as a tank. This is just what I like to use. You can just replace this with another sword and board if you'd like. It's kind of up to you. If you do decide to replace it with a sword and board, I highly recommend having both shields be the same traits, just so you maintain, if you are using, for example, infused on one bar and reinforced on the other, you kind of want to maintain the same resources, but that's not absolutely necessary. And do try to maintain that weakening enchant and infused on the back bar too if you are going to go with the sword and board. So that's kind of one option there. So now there are a couple of alternatives you can use for this build. Instead of Ebon, you can go with Plague instead. If you're running content that has 2 tanks, only 1 tank needs to use Ebon because you can't double up on the Ebon 5-piece effect. So in that instance, you might want to use a different health set like Plague or Warrior Poet or something like that. Probably not Warrior Poet because that doesn't stack with Warhorn, but you can go with Plague Doctor instead. It's kind of up to you how you want to do that. So you can kind of discuss with your tank who gets to wear Ebon and who gets to wear Plague. So just take that into consideration there. That's the only real health set, the only other selfish set. There is Green Pact, but that's actually weaker than Plague in terms of how much health it gives you. So I would just pick up Plague, not even bother with Green Pact if you're looking for a health set here. Another potential set, although this is a crafted set, so you won't be able to necessarily combine it with all the other sets you're going to be using. It's going to be something like Fortified Brass or Histbark. Those are perfectly fine selfish sets to use as well. So for your monster helm, you can go with other options here. So the option that most other tanks go to is going to be Lord Wardens. So Lord Wardens doesn't have the same ulti regen as Blood Spawns, but it does provide very nice resistance boost, and it's more consistent. So you will have on average higher resistances if you're using Lord Wardens. Plus, it'll also give it to mostly your melee DPS because the proc only is 8 meters in radius, so it's only really going to hit your melee DPS. But it does boost out your group resistances as well. Now there is also a third monster helm option, which is good for trash pulls, and that's going to be Thurvokun. Thurvokun comes from Fanglair. Lord Warden comes from ICP, so you do need to have access to ESO Plus or the DLCs. So for ICP in Imperial City Prison, you need to have the Imperial City DLC. For Thurvokun, you need to have the Dragon Bones DLC. So Thurvokun is very useful in that it basically creates a large pool of basically like poison almost, and it afflicts everybody in it with minor maim, which reduces the damage done by 15%. So you don't necessarily have to now go out and use something like Talons, for instance, or choking Talons to mass apply minor maim. You can just get hit, and Thurvokun will proc because it lasts for 8 seconds, and the effect has an 8-second cooldown, so it's always going to be active if you're taking damage. So this is a very, very good source of applying minor maim across multiple enemies at once. So I wouldn't necessarily use this for boss fights necessarily, where you only have one boss, so you just use Heroic Slash for your minor maim. But I would use this for something like trash pulls, where you have a lot of trash and you don't necessarily want to use Magicka using Talons, choking Talons, to stop enemies. Choking Talons does have a limit of 6 enemies, and you obviously don't want to run around Heroic Slashing everything in order to apply minor maim, so that's where Thurvokun really shines. It's in those trash pulls, and it's particularly powerful in places like Hoth and Maw, where trash pulls are actually fairly dangerous, and it even finds use in places like Sanctum of Phidia, places with overchargers in the Kraglorn Trials, where you will that extra minor maim will really help reduce the damage taken by the group. Now for the debuff set, now you do have another option here. Instead of using Alkosh, I'll actually swap over to it right now. There we go. That's going to be Torx Pack. Torx Pack is a crafted set. It is a 3-trait set, so you only need to know 3 traits in order to craft each set. So this decreases the weapon enchant cooldown and increases the potency of your enchant by 30%. So if you take a look here at the Crusher enchant with the Alkosh infused, it was 2108, and now with Torx Pack it's 2740. It lasts for 5 seconds, and now with the Torug's 5-piece, it is now, the cooldown is now reduced from 5 seconds with Infused down to 3.5 seconds with Torug. So Torug's Infused Crusher is basically, you're pretty much guaranteed to have 100% uptime with Torug's Infused Crusher. While it is going to end up being weaker than Alkosh, so if you take a look at Alkosh right now, the 5-piece reduces resistances by 30-10. Add that on the Crusher enchant, and you get 51-18 as your total resistance debuff. So Torug's is weaker in terms of the amount of resistances that it removes from the boss. However, Torug's is a lot more consistent. You can pretty much guarantee 100% uptime on Torug's Infused Crusher. So you can't really necessarily guarantee that with Alkosh. Now, there have been changes with the synergy, so they're a lot easier to activate. So it's a lot easier now to get 100% uptime on Alkosh, but it still requires a lot of thinking, and it's definitely more difficult than people make it out to be. If you have two tanks running two Alkosh sets, then it is possible to get, it's a lot easier to get 100% Alkosh uptime, but there is going to be, you will have to communicate with the other tanks so that way your Alkoshes aren't necessarily overlapping each other, because there is that 20-second cooldown between synergies. So if you only have, for example, one synergy source, then you can only get 50% uptime on Alkosh. However, if you have two or more synergy sources, then you can theoretically get 100% uptime on Alkosh, and that will end up beating out Torx Pack. The uptime percentage that you need for Alkosh in order to win out over Torx Pack is only 22%. However, the weakness of Alkosh is that it's going to be in spurts. So you can think of, if you think of it like as a graph, the way it works is you have huge debuff when Alkosh is active, then it's going to drop, and then it's going to be active again, and so on and so forth. So you're basically trading off consistency in return for much higher debuffs. So you kind of want to balance that out and try to figure that out for yourself. So Alkosh is not great for all groups. In very well organized groups with very good tanks, that Alkosh does really begin to shine and really shows in terms of the DPS output. However, for less experienced groups, Torx Pack is going to be a lot more consistent, and so it's a lot easier to use Torx Pack. And it's also a lot easier to obtain Torx Pack since it is a crafted set. The downside of using Torx Pack is that you will need jewelry. So you can see here we do have Ebon jewelry, so this is the 2 shield plays and the reduced stamina cost enchant, like I was saying earlier. So that's the only downside here, and like I said earlier, Ebon jewelry, while gold Ebon jewelry has popped up on the guild trader, you need to have the gold or the AP to buy it. So you can see here I only had enough gold or AP to buy 1 gold Ebon ring. So my 5-piece effect here is going to be weaker compared to if I had all Ebon on my body. So that's something you want to keep in mind. It's not going to make that much of a difference. I believe the difference is only like, let's see, 1092, where's Ebon? Yeah, so the difference here is not that much. It's only like 10 to 20 additional health, so it's not that big of a difference, but it is something that you want to keep in mind there. If you decide to use Torux, you will need to farm for Ebon jewelry and not Ebon armor pieces, so you will have to do it on vet in order to get the purple jewelry pieces. So that's pretty much it for gear options. I'll have all that listed down in the description below for you guys. So let's move on to character sheet. So I am a Dark Elf. Race doesn't really matter all that much when it comes to tanking. When it comes to tanking, it's a lot more about learning the mechanics, being familiar with the mechanics, being familiar with resource management, things like that. And while certain races have better resource pools, it doesn't necessarily make them better than other races when it comes to tanking. So for this particular build here, I've tanked everything. I've tanked all the base game trials on hard mode with this tank. I have tanked Vet Maw as an off tank and a main tank on this tank. I have tanked off-tanked Hoff up until the refabrication committee on this character. I have tanked main tanked Hoff some of the fights on this character, and I have main tanked Asylum on this character, both +0, +1, and +2 on this tune. So you obviously you don't need to be like a Red Guard or an Imperial in order to be a very successful tank. So I'm a Dunmer here, and I've seen and played with other tanks that are Khajiits. I've played with an Ultimate tank before, so race doesn't really matter that much. If you do want to min-max though, in my opinion, the top 3 races for tanking are in order: Argonians, because their potion passive is pretty strong in terms of sustain, but you will usually end up, when you drink a potion, it'll return, I think it's around like 12,000 resources, so you do need to be mindful. You will usually end up overfilling your resource bars with it, so that's something to be mindful of. Imperials are locked behind the Imperial Edition upgrades, so that's kind of the only downside of that. It gives you max health and max stamina though, which are really, really nice bonuses for tanks, obviously. And then finally, Red Guards. Red Guards get a lot of extra stamina, and they do get the Adrenaline Rush boost, so they do have additional source of stamina regen, but you do need to learn how to weave and use your abilities wisely in order to get that regen back. So those are the top 3 races if you truly want to min-max your chances here. Dark Elves are perfectly fine for tanking. You get max magicka, 9% max magicka, and 6% max stamina, so I mean it helps out your resource pools, but technically speaking, yes, Argonians, Imperials, and Red Guards are technically better tanks just because they have better stamina resource pools or better health resource pools. For our attributes, so there's no real set way to allocate your attributes here. Like I said earlier, the most important thing is to make sure that your stamina is above your magicka. You can see here my stamina is about 300, higher than my magicka, and that's what's the most important thing here. We want to make sure your stamina is above your magicka, so when you get your orb or your shard, you're getting stamina back and not magicka. So you can play around with your attributes as needed. So I have 60 into health and 4 into stamina, and combine that with the stamina enchant on my shoulder, my Bloodspawn shoulder or my Lord Warden shoulder, I will always have my stamina higher than my magicka no matter which setup I have on my tank. So that's kind of how I came up with this particular attribute setup. Now you can go 64 points into health. That won't work for me because then my stamina is lower, my magicka is higher than my stamina, so you do play around a little bit. Basically you want to put in as many points as you can into health, up until the point where your magicka is basically no higher than your stamina. So I have the warrior here because I am actually on I stam DPS kind of mindset here, but you would be using the Atronach instead. The Atronach gives you magicka regen, which is very important for a tank because a lot of your buff skills do use magicka, so you want to have higher magicka regen. So ignore the fact that I have the warrior, you would be using the Atronach instead. And we are using tri-stat food, so that's purple food that boosts max health, max magicka, and max stamina. So that's the food that you're going to want to use here. Now moving on to our skills. So this is going to be our front bar here. I have Pierce Armor, which is our taunt, Heroic Slash for the ulti regen. Igneous Shield, this is our main source of basically restoring our stamina. If we go over here to the Helping Hands passive, so whenever we cast Igneous Shields we get 990 stamina back, so this is our source of stamina regen, basically, additional stamina regen. You can see here it does cost magicka, so that's why we want to have decent magicka regen. Balance, which helps out with our regen as well, it really helps out with our sustain. You're basically trading health for magicka. Some people don't like it, but I find it to be incredibly useful for that additional regen. It's just incredible for sustain, and with this, with balance, you get major resolve, major war, so you don't have to use spiked armor, so that frees up an additional slot on your back bar as well. Absorb magic for the block passives. And then I have replenishing barrier, but you can replace this with something like Magma Shell if you'd like, or Warhorn. I just have this here for the 10% additional 10% additional regen from magicka 8, so that's why I have replenishing barrier here. Now for a back bar, so now this, remember I am using a staff back bar, so that's why I have Blockade here, so this is pretty much going to be a flex spot. So the two main skills that you're going to want to keep on your back bar are going to be Inner Rage, which is going to be your ranged taunt, and Green Dragon Blood, which is basically like your oh crap I'm going to die button. So you basically hit this, and you pretty much can pop up from like 10% health all the way up to 80. So these next three slots are basically flex spots. You don't need to necessarily use the skills that I have here, and it's all going to be varying depending on the content you're going to be running and whether you're using a staff or not. So if you are using a staff, obviously you're going to want to have Blockade down. That's just going to help out with Crusher enchant because it'll help proc Crusher when you're on your front bar. So basically you lay down Blockade, you swap to your front bar, and that's basically it. You can basically block that entire time and you'll be able to apply your enchant. So that's why we have Blockade here. We have Talons, choking Talons here for trash pulls. Not all mobs can be restrained by Talons, only going to be basically minor mobs, so anything that has a fancy health bar won't be able to be restrained by choking Talons, but it will still apply minor maims, so that's why we have this here. It's kind of for crowd control. And then Unrelenting Grip is obviously for crowd control. You basically pull ranged enemies to you, Talons them, and then let your DPS burn them down. However, you do have a lot of options here when it comes to skills. So let's just start off here since we're on a support line. You can use Stalwart Guard to help guard either your tank if they're taking a lot of damage, for example in Rakat, on Vet Maw, or you can guard a DPS, preferably a Magicka DPS because they don't have a source of minor force, in order to help them deal a little bit more DPS that way. So that's one option there. Do keep in mind if you're using Stalwart Guard, you will need to replace an ability on your front bar because you do need to have it double barred in order to get the most out of it. You can have Efficient Purge. This is in case you are running content where you have status effects that you're going to need to purge off yourself. For example, in Hoth, that first boss, the Raptor bosses, you will need to have Purge in order to get rid of your poison for you, depending on the strategy you're running. So Purge is very useful there, so that's another option there. Let's see, Assault. You can go with Vigor, Resolving, or Echoing. Echoing is technically better because it hits more of your allies, but Resolving is better for your own self-heals. I have Resolving because this does double as my stamina DPS, so that's why I have Resolving, but you can go with Echoing as well. This is just another source of heal, self-heal. It does cost stamina, so don't use it as your primary means of self-healing, so do keep that in mind. You can use Caltrops as well to help draw aggro, but that's kind of up to you if you want to do that or not. And then Rapid's Retreating Maneuver, that's to help out move things along if you're doing a speed run for score or something like that. Let's see here. Ring of Preservation or Ring of Protection, Circle of Protection. This is going to be useful in certain scenarios where you guys are all stacked and you need to reduce the damage taken. So it does reduce damage taken by 8%. It does cost a crap ton of stamina, so do keep that in mind. This is mostly going to be used for Execute, for example, in Rakat, or the Mage, or the Assembly General. So that's where you would use Circle of Protection. Nothing really else here. Let's see here. Vampire, Elusive Mist might be useful. It's kind of a very, very niche skill. I've only ever had to use it once, and that's in AS hard mode, so that's something you want to keep in mind. Nothing under the armor skill tree, nothing here. Crushing Shock, if you are using a staff on your backbar, might be nice to have in case you do need to do a ranged interrupt. It's nice. It's a nice to have skill, but not necessary, especially if you have magic and DPS. They should be running Crushing Shock for you. And let's see here, and I think that's pretty much, oh, nope, so Dragonfire Scale or Reflective Plate, that's another thing to consider having as a flex spot. It gives you Minor Ward, which helps out your spell resistance, although you should be hitting cap pretty easily as a Dragonknight, so you don't necessarily need that Minor Ward. You can go with Dragonfire Scale instead. It just helps protect you from projectile enemies, so for example against Valarial, basically can take 4 hits from her without having to worry, as long as those 4 hits come within 6 seconds. Deep Breath is also another option for an interrupt. Doesn't have the same radius, obviously, the same range as Crushing Shock, but it is an option. It's also an AoE interrupt, so it's very useful for instances where you have to interrupt multiple enemies. For example, on top boss on HRC, or potentially the spheres in against the first boss in Hoth, or twins. We have to interrupt all the white adds on the twins in Maw. That's instances where Deep Breath might be useful. And that's pretty much it when it comes to skills here. And now finally let's talk about our CP point distributions. Start off with our green CPs. So I have 64 in a cannon, 64 in tenacity. You can put 75 there if you'd like. But as you will see, it's not going to be, by putting those 75 into those, you're losing 22 points elsewhere, which is going to be more important. So I have 56 in the Shadow Ward. Reducing cost of block is going to be very important here. So I have 56. You can go, I believe the next jump point is 64 to get 21% reduction. You do definitely want to have a lot of points in the Shadow Ward in order to reduce the cost of block due to those changes in block cost from the Dragon Mode's update. 20 into Tumbling and 20 into Warlord. That's just to help conserve stamina when we have to dodge roll or use Break Free. Blue CPs, doesn't matter where you put them. I have these set up as a stamina DPS, but for a tank, you would usually want, if you're a pure tank, like you're not going to be doing stamina DPS on your tank like I am, you would have 100 into Blessed, 100 into Elfborn, and then put the rest into Precise Strikes if you're using Vigor. That's just to help out your heals when you have crit heals. So your crit chance is going to be low, it's going to be around 15 to 20%, but it'll just help out when you do happen to get the occasional crit heal with Precise Strikes, so from your Vigor. So that's where I'd put it. So this is all just stamina DPS specs right now, but if I were to go pure tank, it'd be 100, 100, and 40. And for our red CPs, I like to take a one-size-fits-most approach, leaning more towards Ironclad versus Thick-Skinned, but you might need to change this up depending on the content you're running. Tanks will have a different CP setup compared to DPS when it comes to red CPs, just because you're potentially taking different sources of damage than your DPS, so that's something you want to keep in mind. I have 66 into Ironclad, 1 to Spell Shield, 34 into Thick-Skinned, 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, and I have 11 into Bastion. You might want to put a little bit more points into Bastion if you'd like. Take some out of, like, you know, Hardy or Elemental Defender, put them down to 56 and put the rest into Bastion if you'd like. It's kind of up to you. I just have 11 points here for the Field Physician passive again. This tune doubles as stamina DPS, so that's why I don't have as many points into Bastion as I would normally. So that's one thing to also keep in mind here. So now that all of that is kind of out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about kind of the mindset behind tanking. So a lot of people think that tanking vet content basically consists of perma-blocking, and that's not necessarily true, especially with the changes in block cost from Dragon Balls. You're going to have to learn to read your boss and kind of learn the mechanics and find openings to heavy attack. So obviously what you're going to want to do is you obviously want to maintain your taunt. So for me, it's always going to be Pierce Armor. And then the next thing you're always going to want to maintain is going to be Minor Heroism from your Heroic Slash. So you always want to have Minor Heroism up. So you're always going to want to use your Heroic Slash every 8 seconds, because that's how long the Minor Heroism buff lasts. Or I think it's actually 9 seconds from from Heroic Slash. You're going to want to try to maintain that as much as you can. It's also for that minor main from Heroic Slash, that lasts for 12 seconds. That reduces damage dealt by the boss by 15%, so you always want to have that up as well. So now, if you are using a staff backbar, you obviously want to try to maintain Blockade as best you can. That's just to help maintain your Crusher uptime, so that's something to keep in mind as well. Some tanks like to maintain the green dragon blood even if they don't need the heal. That's just due to the passive boost from Major Fortitude and Minor Vitality. That just helps your health regen and increases your healing received. So some people like to maintain green dragon blood throughout the fight in order to get that 8% additional healing done. It's not necessary. So just bear in mind what your resource levels are at. I try to keep it up the best I can, but obviously I don't maintain it as well as I should. Now, during the fight, if you are running low on magicka, for example, you've just had to use a couple of Igneous shields in order to get your stamina back up, you can use balance to get back your magicka back. So the balance, the danger of using balance is obviously it uses health, so you need to be very reliant on your healer, because balance also has a 4-second debuff that cuts the healing that you do to yourself, as well as the shields that you give to yourself by 50%. So if we do balance and then shield, you can see we only get 6.5k shields compared to, let's balance right now, a 13k shield. So that's something you want to keep in mind there. So if I use, for example, if you use balance and then, not that green dragon blood, while you have the balance debuff up, it won't heal you for the same amount as if you don't have the balance debuff up. So you're going to want to keep that in mind, and if you do want to follow it up with a self-heal, you will have to deal with less self-heal, or you're just going to have to time it so you don't have the balance debuff up anymore. So just bear that in mind if you're using balance to sustain yourself. If you don't want to use balance to sustain yourself, then you can use hardened armor instead for your major resistance buff, but balance is just so powerful for sustain. You just have to kind of learn when you're able to use it and when you can't. So that's something you want to keep in mind. And then for Warhorn uptime, Warhorns, basically you're going to want to coordinate that with your group. Make sure you're not blowing Warhorns on top of each other. Call out your Warhorns. Typically speaking, you say, my horn or my Warhorn in 3, 2, 1, and then you blow your horn. And that's just to make sure that you're not overlapping Warhorns, because it's mainly for the major force. Major force lasts for 9.5 seconds, so you don't want to blow your horn when there's already major force up, because that just wastes the extra time. So you want to maximize the amount of time of major force that you've managed to get. That's why you kind of want to time your Warhorns with your other support roles. So that's basically it for this build. I know there was a lot of information to cover, but support roles are a lot more complex than DPS because we don't have set rotation. There's a lot of consideration you have to take and a lot of adaptation that you have to do. So do leave any comments down below with any questions that you might have, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. And again, I will put down the various gear options that you have down in the description below. So that's it for this build video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.